Well, good morning. Good morning from London. Good morning from Australia. Good morning from Oxford. It's a real pleasure to host this session, Fixing the Crises in Capitalism and Democracy. My name is Mike Wardle. I'm the chair for today's session. My job is really to make the introductions, do the housekeeping, and then get out of the way so we can hear from our speakers today. Just a word of thanks to our sponsors. We're very fortunate at the FS Club to have a range of sponsors who allow us to run these webinar series and to range quite far and wide across issues of economics, finance, technology and science. We really are appreciative for their support. The agenda today is quite simple. After my brief introductions, we'll move into three keynote presentations from Martin Wolf, Professor Colin Mayer and Dr. Shann Turnbull. I won't go into great detail on their biographies, they're all being published on the website. And then there'll be time for Q&A towards the end of the session. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way to ask a question is to find the Questions tab on the dashboard on your screen, type in your question, that will come to us to field during the Q&A. And you can put a question or an observation at any point during the webinar. So if you have a really bright idea and don't want to lose it, put your question in and we'll take those when we get to the Q&A portion. The session today is being recorded, so if you want to go back and remind yourself of what was said, or if you have friends and colleagues who you think might be interested, the recording will be published on our website and our YouTube channel in around 24 hours from now. So there's that opportunity to go back. And finally, if you do ask a question today, we will share contacts with our speakers so that if there's any need or any wish for any follow-up discussion, that can also take place. I think that does me for the housekeeping and introduction. It's a real pleasure to welcome Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator, Financial Times. His most recent publication is The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, and we thought that was a good starting point. Colin Mayer is Emeritus Professor of Management Studies at the Surrey Business School at the University of Oxford. His most recent book is Capitalism and Crises, How to Fix Them, and again brings a particular range of expertise to our discussions this morning. Dr. Shann Turnbull is the founding principal of the International Institute for Self-Governance and has done a lot of work working with stakeholder democracy and is a prolific author on using self-governing practices of biota to reform the theories and practice of capitalism. So we have a very distinguished panel today, and without any further ado, I'd like to ask Martin to kick us off. Martin, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's a great honor and pleasure to participate in a discussion of these immensely important matters with two such distinguished and admired friends and scholars. I'm going to try and set the stage by trying to bring together in a very brief form my thinking on the relationship between democracy and capitalism, and very briefly where we are. And I hope that will set the scene for our subsequent discussion. Now, let's start off by noting that democracy of the type we now have, universal suffrage, representative democracy, is a really recent development historically. If you look at standard databases, and there's some very good ones, there are simply no democracies in this sense 200 years ago. Even where Republican institutions did exist, as in, for instance, the early United States, the franchise was highly restricted on the grounds of sex, race, and wealth. To give you an indication, in the US in 1800, the proportion of the population that had the vote was about 6%. Then in the 19th century, franchises were widened, and universal suffrage democracy of the type we are familiar with emerged and spread in fits and starts to cover half the world's countries after 1990. That was the high point, and it has been declining once again, slowly recently, but I think we can look at what's just happened in the US presidential election and ask how long this is going to go on. So why did the rise of democracy occur? After all, the normal way to structure the economies and politics of complex societies, agrarian and post-agrarian societies, has been for power to accrue to wealth and wealth to accrue to power. Essentially, they were plutocracies. The most powerful people in society were the richest and vice versa, and absolute monarchs was thought of as owning everything. Why then did this move towards democracy occur at all? The answer lies with the emergence of what I call a marriage between a liberal economy and a democratic polity. Fundamentally, in my view, markets protect democratic politics from an excessive concentration of power, while democratic politics protects markets from an excessive concentration of wealth. That's what has to happen for the system to work. So I define market capitalism and democracy as complementary opposites. What do they share? A market economy and a universal suffrage democracy both reject the idea of ascribed hereditary status. They both also embrace the idea that people are entitled to decide important things for themselves. Market capitalism rests at least on ideals of free labor, individual effort, reward for merit, and of course the rule of law. Democracy rests on ideals of free discussion and debate among citizens when making those laws. Historically, the market economy also brought with it urbanization, a need for a more educated workforce, a crucial point, a newly organized working class as a political force, and with rising prosperity, opportunity for a positive sum form of politics. This is how the market economy and liberal democracy are, in my view, complementary. Yet democracy and capitalism are also opposites. Capitalism is inherently cosmopolitan. The democratic state is territorial. The market is the domain of exit. Democracy is the domain of voice. The market economy is inegalitarian, $1, one vote. Democracy is inherently egalitarian, at least in principle. One person, one vote. If the economy fails to serve the interests of the majority, the sense of shared citizenship will then fray, and populist demagogues are likely to emerge. We've seen this before in the 20s and 30s, and we're seeing it again. Populism is not in itself necessarily lethal for democracy, indeed the opposite, so long as it takes the form of an often justified and even fruitful hostility to elites. But often it takes the form instead of hostility to pluralism itself, which is a fundamental element in any democracy. Pluralism not just of culture, but more profoundly of values. Democracy will then be transformed into a plebiscitary dictatorship and ultimately a dictatorship to core. Alternatively, the concentration of wealth will lead to plutocracy as wealth is once again transmuted into power in the historic manner. Fear of downward mobility has, in my view, and I argue this at length, created status anxiety and profound cynicism. These have then been diverted by successful right-wing propagandists into cultural and racial resentments, especially in ethnically diverse societies. Mass immigration has proved to be a potent weapon in this form of politics. The needed renewal of democracy and capitalism must, in my view, be animated by a simple but powerful idea, that of a shared citizenship. And today, that sense of citizenship must have at least three dimensions: loyalty to democratic political and legal institutions and the values of open debate and mutual tolerance that underpin them; concern for the ability of fellow citizens to live a fulfilled life; and the desire to create an economy that allows those citizens to flourish. We are, in the end, social animals. We have to act collectively as well as individually. Acting together within a democracy means acting and thinking as citizens. If we do not do this, democracy will fail and autocracy will return. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Moving on, I'd like to ask Professor Colin Mayer to take the floor.
Thank you, Michael. In this session, we're hearing two very powerful arguments for how economics and politics and the governance of economies, society, and the environment need to be fixed to avoid catastrophic outcomes for all of them. I agree with both. As Martin argues, both democracy and capitalism are central to our functioning economies and societies, complementary opposites, as he put it. And as Shann argues, governance needs to be devolved in the polycentric form that Elinor Ostrom has proposed. But while avoidance of autocracy and authoritarianism and prosperity that capitalism has delivered are essential, what emerged in the post-Second World War period was a belief in more than that, that economics and politics could solve problems that you and I face as individuals, societies, and the natural world of education, health, social care, avoidance of poverty, and inequality. And for a period of about 20 years after World War II, it appeared to be that that was what democratic capitalism was delivering, with the emergence of the welfare state and rising levels of incomes and equality around the world. But the story since then has been of rising levels of disenchantment, as one shock after another, starting first with the oil price shock in the 1970s, deflected economies from their intended path. The frequency, severity, and prevalence of those shocks have accelerated since then, especially over the last 2 decades, with financial, environmental, global health, and social inequality shocks, amongst many others, adding to the list. Our democratic capitalism simply hasn't been up to what was expected or hoped of it. Why? What lay behind the success of the early post-World War II periods were 2 things. First, enlightened government, as reflected in, for example, the national health systems and social welfare programs that were introduced in many countries around the world. For a brief period, it looked as if you did not have to be super rich to survive and thrive. The second was a growing corporate sector that delivered goods, services, and jobs for the benefit of customers, societies, and workers in a form that complemented what governments were doing. What happened thereafter was that the affordability of the programs that governments initiated became increasingly difficult to sustain, and across the world there were calls to rein in the borders of the state. But the other thing that happened was that the benign view of corporate leaders of their role in benefiting their customers, employees, and societies gave way to one of a fixation on profits for their shareholders. The implicit partnership between business and government thereby became increasingly confrontational, with governments having to pick up the tab for the mess that business was causing in terms of inequality, instability, and most recently, the environment. That is creating immense social and political divisions, growing polarization, and threatens our democratic system. But it's only now that we're really beginning to understand the nature of the problem. The problem is the heart of capitalism and the fuel that powers it, namely profit. Profit is the source of the resource that powers capitalism and the incentive that drives it. Without profit, there's no capital in capitalism. The fundamental problem is that we're misspecifying what a profit is. What we measure as a profit is too frequently not a profit at all, certainly in the sense of the origins of the word, namely from the Latin proficere and profectus, to advance and progress. Too much profit comes from neither advancement nor progress, but from advantage and regress. And until we recognize and address this, then anything that we do in terms of standard economics for correcting market failures fails. Competition, regulation, and taxation, as we have seen, all frequently fail. We must recognize that the core of a functioning economy is one simple principle: profit without harm. That is the equivalent of the Hippocratic oath in medicine of do no harm, which cannot possibly apply in business because business is always doing some harm. But profit without harm can and must prevail if markets and economies are to function. Adam Smith recognized this in The Wealth of Nations as a necessary condition for the functioning of markets when he said, "Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interests in his own way and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men." What he was saying was that competition to profit without harm promotes runs to the top. Competition to profit with harm creates runs to the bottom. And it's the latter which is precisely what we are currently experiencing all too often. We should simply not tolerate companies profiting at others and our expense. Fortunately, there is at last a growing recognition by the leaders of businesses around the world of the unsustainability of the current situation, and more significantly, an increasing appreciation of the straightforward ways in which it can be addressed. British company law and its corporate governance code, including provisions that could be used to enforce this and hold directors and owners to account for doing it, And government procurement, investment, subsidies, licenses and chartering could and should be used to require it of all private provision of public goods and services. Private procurement alone accounts for approximately a third of total government spending. What more it takes in terms of ownership, governance, leadership, measurement and reporting for this to be done is what I describe in my book, Capitalism and Crises. And so I'm afraid that since my 5 minutes is up, I must instead ask you, please, to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. And finally in our speaker list, Dr. Shann Turnbull. Over to you, Shann.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. You gave a beautiful oversight of the interlinking between democracy and capitalism, and thank you also, Colin, for setting out your vision, which I agree with. My approach, I've got 5 slides, 5 minutes, and 5 points. The first one is identifying the problem. The second one is the vision of where we want to get to. The third one is the process of using a tax incentive to get the change and a total reset. Then I look at the mechanism of how it works and look at the outcomes. And I see fixing the crisis of capitalism and democracy requires a radical reduction of inequality. The combined, both problems are combined. There's 8 billionaires own as much as the poorest half of the global population. Elon Musk is the richest. Now he holds all his wealth through corporations. Now corporations dominate the world's top 100 economic entities. The largest single corporation has revenues greater than the GDPs of all but the top 9 nations. The market capitalization of Apple would make it the 8th largest country, but combined with Microsoft and Saudi Aramco, only the US and China would have larger entities. Now, the solution I see is the need for a total reset of corporate power. At the moment, all listed companies are like command and control hierarchies, like a central committee of a communist state. You have a central committee at the top and a command and control. I know of no business school or management school or school of government that teaches bottom-up stakeholder governance. There's many practical examples of stakeholder governance, like the John Lewis Partnership in the UK, the Mondragon Cooperative in Europe, and the Visa Corporation in America, employing 80,000 people. All living things are self-governing and self-regulating. Engineers know how to design self-governing organization or automobiles. Social scientists have an intellectual void of how to apply the existing knowledge of self-regulation and self-governance to social institutions. Where we want to end up is circular economy shown in green on the right-hand side of the slide, with bottom-up distributed decision-making, which Ellen Ostrom calls polycentric governance, of self-governing bi-regional hierarchies composed of autonomous communities. Now, next slide, we go to the how do we get there? And the idea is counterintuitive. We give the shareholders a tax credit to change corporate constitutions in 3 ways. First is to separate the power to manage a business from the power to govern the corporation. I've introduced this for 2 enterprises I've founded to facilitate raising high-risk venture capital. There's no commercial reasons for directors to have both the power to manage the business and to manage the corporation. It creates unethical conflicts, systemic unethical conflicts of interest, and it complicates their lives. Division of power needs different skill sets and different people, and so you get specialization of functions and eliminate most systemic conflicts. The second change in the corporate constitutions is the tax incentive gives bigger profits quicker with less risk. In return, the shareholders agree to endow 5% of their equity each year to a stakeholder account, simply by book entries. The stakeholder shares can be gifted only to voting citizens in the host bioregion that elects the politicians that provide the tax incentives. After 20 years, firms become 100% stakeholder owned. You might think 20 years is too short, but I've twice raised venture capital with property rights limited to 15 years. And if you give investors ownership for longer, you're sabotaging yourself, the economy, and exacerbating the inequality of that we've got to cure. Now, the other changes is to provide resources to each citizen stakeholder constituency to establish advisory boards to retain professional advocates and mentors to management. Ralph Nader established these in the United States, and they still exist today because they add value. And that way, corporations become a common pool resource providing benefits to all citizens. What it looks like, polycentric governance, you'll see the shareholders are down the bottom right-hand side, electing 2 boards, one on a plutocratic basis, as usual, 1 vote per share, and the other one, the governance board at the top of the red, it's 1 vote per person. And then the stakeholder boards, no business can exist without stakeholders, and Larry Fink says you need to hear their voices. So you have employee assemblies, you have a supply forums, customer councils, and community committees, providing a stakeholder council which advises the governance board on the key performance indicators for hiring and paying the directors and the management board. It's a way of negotiating win-win solutions on all sides, as Ellen Austin showed in her Nobel Prize lecture, where you get self-governance. You can't get self-governance without a distribution of power. The result of all this, that firms grow by giving birth to offspring enterprises, funded by dividend reinvestment plans and attracting new investors with the tax incentives. Offspring firms provide succession plans for the shareholders, the managers, and the business, and they keep corporations to human scale. Shareholder primacy is maintained. Stakeholder dividends build a universal well-being income and a circular self-reliance bioregional economies to enrich democracies at all levels. The tax incentive becomes self-financing from new taxes on shares gifted to citizens, and the cost savings from replacing welfare costs. The universal well-being income reduces the incentive to breed, to fund old age, with bioregions self-determining sustainable population levels according to the endowments of nature of their area. That's how Indigenous Australians existed for 65,000 years. The size of government at all levels are reduced, and in Australia, the need to pay 12% of your wages to fund pensions would be removed. So that's something for considering the electoral attractiveness for both sides of the aisle. For the rich get incentives to get bigger profits, and the majority become capitalists. Thank you for your attention, and thank you very much for my colleagues for being with us in this roundtable.
Well, thank you very much indeed. A really fascinating oversight as to some of the problems that we are facing in terms of democracy and capitalism. We've got a number of questions coming in. I'm going to start with Nikki Holthausen, who's asked whether there's a need for global leaders who don't have a specific personal financial interest in the global economy and therefore can define governance, fairness and rules which balance and protect environment, society and fair markets. What's the role of global leadership?
None. You've got to change the system. You don't do it unless they implement the sort of ideas I'm talking about. And one example, Senator Russell Long, who adopted, he led America to getting employee share ownership plans by tax incentives.
Other thoughts about the leadership? Is this a problem which can be addressed by global leadership or by national leadership indeed?
Well, my view is that...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Martin. Martin, you go first.
Well, these are obviously huge questions, and some of the, assuming we go along with the sorts of ideas that Colin and Shann put forward, the obvious question is what sort of political processes might implement these ideas and where and how. And I think the question is addressed to that. And I think it's a very, very good question. I suppose my instinct is that I consider myself in some sense a realist. Power matters. So if we're going to try and transform the way institutions that have power and give power to their leaders behave, both political and corporate institutions, is what we're doing. We have to ask ourselves what political processes, broadly defined, will deliver that. And that is where the question of leadership really does arise, because it depends on who they are and what legitimizes them. There are many problems here, but the first one is, of course, political power rests within national institutional systems, and national institutional systems tend to be very conservative and tend to choose leaders in their own molds and in that represent dominant interests. So we are seeing the replication of plutocratic modes of power. Surely the election of Donald Trump is a pretty obvious example of that in some way. And that means that the leadership you want doesn't operate at the national level, but global institutions of any kind ultimately depend for their capacity to change the law, change behavior, but above all, the legal systems in which people operate, the sort of thing that Shann is talking about and Colin's talking about. That depends on the coercive capacity of states, because actually international bodies, except the EU, don't have coercive capacity of their own. So the question that is being asked, how do you affect change, and where does leadership, is, to my mind, the core question. And historically, well, it's been very, very difficult to bring huge change without huge upheaval. So I'll just make this a last comment. Colin pointed out the immense changes after World War II. I would argue that's because of the Great Depression and World War II, which were huge upheavals. Other huge changes have occurred as a result of revolutions like the American War of Independence. And it's not, on the whole, in my view, and I suspect this is a difference from others, this is not something that happens without political upheavals of a very large kind. And that's one of the reasons I tend to be a bit pessimistic.
Thank you. Colin.
So if I could just add to that. And first of all, I think the point that Martin's making about upheavals is absolutely right. And one thing that Friedman said that I do agree with is that it's only crisis, actual perceived, that produces real change. And that has been our experience, that we have to have crises to bring about the sorts of changes one needs. The question is, to what extent can one introduce mechanisms that encourage change before the crises become completely out of control? Because what both Shann and I are talking about are not revolutions, they're reforms to an existing system. And of course, if one relies on crises to do the job, is that the danger is you throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that is what I think we are all concerned about the increasing frequency and prevalence of crises around the world. So the issue that I think we really need to address is there some fundamental failing in terms of leadership that can be altered in such a way as to promote the desired outcomes? And if one looks at the way in which business is currently incentivized, it's not only that we select the wrong leaders, we incentivize them in the wrong way. And the strains to which that gives rise places immense problems in the political sphere as well as in the corporate sphere. So one can at least start off by addressing those failures that are manifestly present. And how does one bring that about without relying on the political leadership to do that? The answer to that is that there are mechanisms that already exist within our systems to bring this about that don't need profound radical change. They can be done through the existing legal systems, provided we recognize the instruments that we have available to us. And that is what I'm arguing we have, but we're not effectively implementing them in a way that's going to bring about change before we hit even worse crises.
Just Nikki, who asked the question, has commented the crises that may lead to change are looming. Climate, biodiversity, loss, geopolitical challenges, are all upon us in various ways. I'm going to move on to two questions I think can be linked. Chris Wood refers to Fritz Schumacher and the concept of meta-economics, an element outside the normal realm of thinking about the subject. and asked to what extent our difficulties are due to a lack of a moral, ethical, or spiritual dimension in our approach. And Sarah Wilson's asked about sort of the rational apathy of investment managers towards active stewardship, and whether asset managers need to be more active and forceful in their engagement. So some linked questions really about where does morality and active engagement make a difference? Martin, would you like to go first on this?
Well, I'll comment on one aspect of this, not the corporate side so much, because it's a whole of society phenomenon. And I'm particularly interested in the interaction of politics with the economy. So I'm complementary in that sense. One of my core arguments is that a democratic political order within which, of course, corporations reside is a moral system. It's based on values, and the moral systems have to be internalized in people, and particularly people in elite positions, because in every complex society there are always opportunities, and always have been, for essentially extractive rent extracting behavior. That's the history of complex society, anything beyond a tight-knit family band. And the things that constrain it are moral systems. So if you have people in power who think that essentially their job is to act like a gangster, then that's what the sort of system you will get. And it's not very difficult when you look around the world to see many examples today, and incredibly many more in the past. Now, how do you generate ethical leadership? The society itself has to be permeated by ethical values, and the core of those values we've known for a very, very long time, and they have to be reinforced. And here I would just add what I think is obviously the problem. And that was my critique of Milton Friedman in recent writings. Once you say that essentially business people, but it's also true, I think, increasingly of politicians, have a sort of moral duty almost to make as much money as they possibly can for themselves and for shareholders, and that's it within the rules of the game, as Milton Friedman put it. But they also create the rules of the game by becoming the dominant political force. The society is almost, I think, irreparable. And the question of how you maintain, I don't think there are simple answers to this, by the way, but the question of how you maintain moral values throughout a society, particularly in the elite, is, to me, increasingly the core question of any sophisticated society. And it's not, to me, very easy to see how that is maintained over time. And we're seeing collapse. Quite obviously, we're seeing collapse now.
Thank you. Shann, have you got any brief comment on this?
Yes, we're suffering group think, as Larry Fink says, in the boardrooms, and because of that, some of my colleagues in Australia, one was a retired Supreme Court judge who introduced anti-corruption legislation in our Parliament. We wrote to the CEO of the International Corporate Governance Network about could they stop their members being their fund managers having ethical blindness, and this is sort of group think, and nobody's prepared to blow the whistle on them. The CEO of the ICGN was well aware of the conflict of interest between auditors and who assess directors being selected and paid by the people they're assessing. It's just an intrinsic, unethical conflict of interest. But that's promoted around the world as good governance. And Sir Adrian Cadbury made an awful mistake. He's poisoned the business ethics around the world by the corporate governance codes. And so virtuous people can act unethically because of the power structure of corporate unitary boards. You've got a single board, you have absolute power to manage your own decisions, to corrupt yourself, the business and society. And until we get the distributed power, like Eleanor Ostrom's promoting with polycentric governance, we can't. Good people can't do good things. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, I'm going to ask you to hold your thoughts on this for a minute and move on to another question, but I'll come to you first on this. Bob McDowell asked, to what extent do you think globalization brought or is one of the factors that brought democracy and capitalism to the crisis? And will the trends to regionalization, protectionism and erosion of global business aspiration and values deliver their own solutions, even if those are very unpalatable solutions?
Globalization was a source of immense benefit to all of us around the world, and the fact that it's now under threat or being reined in is a serious concern. The main reason why one feels that globalization has created problems as well as benefits is the extent to which globalization has also been exploited to the disadvantage of many people around the world. And the most obvious illustration of that is the way in which multinational firms have shifted their activities basically to exploit the lowest cost locations around the world, which in many cases involved exploiting people to the drawback of those countries, but also then to the drawback of the competitive position of those companies that wanted to follow more ethical approaches. So that element of globalization is a reflection of what I was talking about in terms of a run to the bottom, that it's resulted in firms being unable to compete unless they adopt the lowest common denominator. And that's not the only element of problem that has emerged in terms of globalization and internationalization. It's also being reflected in the nature of our investment community. Well, it's not really a community any longer. It's just a whole series of shareholders scattered across the world that have little or no interest in the activities of the companies in which they're investing. Indeed, they don't have any particular interest in the financial performance of any one of their companies. And that's a very different world from the one which started capitalism, where it was very much on the basis of local family, mainly ownership, where there was a sense of some responsibility, at least in some cases, for the way in which companies were operating. So in terms of the international diversification potential of global capital markets, that's of course been something that's of great benefit in terms of spreading and reducing risks of investors. But alongside those benefits of globalization, there has been inherent problems. And underpinning those problems is not globalization as such, it's the way in which institutions are motivated to pursue things that are contrary to the interests of us as individuals and citizens of the world.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to a question from Nigel Lewson, which I think probably is for you, Martin. He comments that you suggest there was a kind of historical or circumstantial inevitability to the fallout between capitalism and democracy, tending towards a market-based autocracy, and just contrast this with the Chinese model, so that this is not necessarily undesirable if the object is to sustain a rising population with rising expectations. Is there a risk that we look at this from a rather narrow Western point of view?
That's a wonderful question. I thought Colin did wonderfully with the previous question. I've written a book about this, but I'm not going to comment on that at all. I think it's a very complex relationship. I would only want to say I care about human beings, not just my own fellow citizens. And I would stress that the opportunities globalization has created in the last 40 years for progress around the world in countries I care about, like China and India, are remarkable. And I would not willingly get rid of them. I'm sorry about that diversion. Can you just repeat very quickly the essence of that question? I'm sorry, I lost my thread for a second.
The question really was whether the move to market autocracy might actually be
Oh
helpful.
yes, the Chinese system. I think that, and I discussed this. To me, democracy has two overwhelming advantages beyond sort of the first is that if something goes seriously wrong in a society, you have a relatively easy way of getting rid of predatory rulers, mass murderers, and so forth. And to put it bluntly, the Chinese communist system, since it got into power in 49, first gave them Mao Zedong, who was one of the world's larger mass murderers, and a brief period, not a brief period, a substantial period on Deng Xiaoping when it worked very well. And then again, now I think the government is making some very, very serious mistakes. And that's the nice way of putting it. And they have no means of changing it. That's a really big problem. And we saw that in the Soviet Union and Putin's regime now. So being able to get rid of people who aren't performing is a very big plus. And the second thing a democracy gives is the assumption, central to what I said, that everybody is entitled to express their views and organize politically to change the government, which means you're going to have the widest possible distribution of opinion freely expressed in a proper democracy. And again, that of course doesn't exist in China. So if the Chinese system is to work, you have to assume you're going to have benevolent and beneficent autocrats overseeing a benevolent and beneficent bureaucracy in perpetuity. And that's not how it works. It's never worked like that, and it doesn't now. So in the long run, in my view, if we stick with democracy and with the difficulties and the inefficiencies and allow this to work, then I think it is clearly demonstrated it's a superior system. And if you look at the world today, I mean, even if you include China, the richest, and on the measurements we know, the most satisfied and happiest and certainly freest people live in liberal democracies. And we can see around the world that people still want this. So I remain of the view that the history of the Chinese Communist Party does not undermine in any way, nor of the other communist parties that we've had, or any similar regime, does not undermine in any way our reason to believe in free societies with all their complexity and difficulties and failures.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I want to take two questions. And Shann, first of all, on you. Adam Donnan says that any change to the system create winners and losers, but there seems to be a reluctance by modern leaders to implement any change that negatively affects any group within society. The whole thing of politics and politicians not being brave enough to say what the implications are of the position we find ourselves in. Have you any comment on that? And also on Gemma Brown's question, who asks, is there any elements of hope or joy for those of us under 30?
Sorry, could you just repeat hope or joy for what was the word?
Any of us under 30.
I still didn't quite get that, but I think you asked.
Okay, is there any hope to be found in the current position for young people in today's economy?
Well, I believe there is hope, and because I believe there is a solution which is win-win for both sides of the aisle of democracies. That you make the rich richer on condition that you spread the wealth of nations to the majority, and so the left can vote for that and the right can vote for that, and because it localizes ownership and control in bioregions, you'll get the Greens voting for it. So you get win-win from all corners of the political spectrum. So I have great hope that if ideas get in good currency, like they did in America back in the 1970s when Russell Long decided to introduce employee ownership tax incentives, we could do the same and reinvent capitalism to purify it and to democratize it, and by doing that you'd enrich the democracies. So I have a lot of hope, as long as the young get these ideas and talk about them and get a conversation going and showing how people wanting political power can get win-win solutions for everybody.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, but one last comment from each of you, I think. Colin.
Okay, I just want to comment on this, young people and hope. Let me end on a very positive note, because we're failing to recognize that, first of all, we are encountering immense technological, scientific improvements that are transforming our lives for the better. I mean, just think of the medical advances that we've seen over the last few years. So that the prospects in terms of utilizing those innovations is immense. And secondly, Milton Friedman went on to say it was new ideas that need to be introduced until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And there are ideas that are emerging, and those ideas really do have potential for addressing the issues that we've been talking about here. So I don't want us to end on an unduly pessimistic note.
Thank you. Martin, last comment?
Yes, I'd like to stress that I'm very depressed when young people tell me that they feel no hope, because objectively, when I think of their position compared to my life in the immediately after the Second World War, let alone my grandparents and great grandparents and so forth, they have the prospect of a long life, probably a healthier life than anybody before them, possibilities of living and reading, learning, traveling in ways that never been enjoyed before. And they're living in a world where more people enjoy this, and a higher proportion of the population than ever before. Just think about what life used to be like for the vast number of peasants who just simply were on the border of survival 150 years ago. So we have immense opportunities, and we still have close to half the regimes of the world are democracies. So I think there's nothing but hope. But they have to believe in that, and they have to be determined to exploit it. And I think they should, and they should not despair. Definitely not.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry we didn't manage to get to all the questions. I say we will pass on questions to the speakers in case they'd like to come back to you. So just remains for me to offer my thanks to our sponsors. As I mentioned before, we're very grateful for their support in helping us run these webinar series. And looking forward, we have obviously other events coming up, but we're now really looking towards the new year. We have a last event of this year on the 18th of December talking about share ownership. And then we come into January with an update on EU financial services legislation and the psychology of worry, how to stop worrying and love the future, which chimes well with our optimistic end to the session. So it just remains for me to thank personally Martin, Colin and Shann. I can see lots of people offering their thanks and applause in the comments. It's been a fascinating session. Shann has also drafted an essay which will be posted on our website very shortly, and we'll make sure we send out a link to that. So thank you all for your attendance, for your engagement. We hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.